Hello and guten Tag, mein Freunde! I'm Peter and here I'm telling you stories about the most interesting European cars of the 80s and 90s. Today we are talking about one of the best and most iconic cars ever made, a virtually immortal masterpiece, the Mercedes-Benz W124. But before we start, I really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button below. It really helps for developing the channel and making more videos. And if you already subscribed, thank you very much. I do appreciate your interest and your trust. Thank you so much, and let's get back to the car. The whole 124 family is commonly known as W124, but actually Daimler-Benz used the W letter for sedans only. Wagons were marked as S124 or 124T, coupes C124, and convertibles A124. There were also stretch long wheelbase limousines V124 and two versions of rolling chassis for some utilitarian use like ambulances or hearses, F124 for a short version and VF124 for a long version. The sedans were produced in Germany from November of 1984 to August of 1995, the wagons from 1985 to 1996, the coupes from 1987 to 1996, and the convertibles from 1992 to July of 1997. In total, just over 2.5 million cars were made in Germany. But this wasn't the actual end of the production. Some cars were later produced in India, Indonesia and Malaysia. And later a South Korean manufacturer SsangYong built its own car SsangYong Chairman on the licensed platform of the Mercedes-Benz 124 and produced this car until 2014. So this car had a very long production life, and even longer life most of the produced cars actually had. The story of the 124 family started in 1976, right after launch of the W123 series, and the first developer of this concept was Hans Scherenberg, who was a huge part of the Mercedes engineering team. He started his work in Daimler-Benz in the 30s. But the next year he retired and the development was continued under the supervision of Werner Breitschwerdt, a head of development for Daimler-Benz, together with famous Bruno Sacca, a leading designer of the company. The development continued till 1982, when the first pre-production prototypes were built. After a thorough testing, the car was finally approved for production and introduced to the public at the Sevilla Motor Show in Spain in September of 1984. The design and engineering concepts were based on the W201 series, also known as 190, which I have another video about. But the new mid-sized car should be bigger and more comfortable to be a good replacement for the extremely popular W123. The 124 of course is much more than just a bigger and wider version of the 190. It has hundreds of different and improved details, but overall resemblance is clearly visible. This was the unique and distinctive look of the Mercedes cars in the 80s and 90s, that was further continued by the W140 S-Class, which we will talk about soon. Two very important parts that influenced the design and development of the car were aerodynamics and safety. The 124 had one of the best aerodynamics in the world for its time, with a drag coefficient of 0.28 for diesel models and 0.30 for gasoline cars. It was better than many sports cars of the 80s and still is very impressive for a passenger sedan. Everything in the body design worked for this: the angle of the windscreen, the undercarriage cover closing the lower part of the engine, and even a windscreen wiper. Like the 190, the 124 had only one huge windscreen wiper, moving by a weird jumping trajectory. But this worked perfectly, and the wiper cleaned 86% of the windshield, while the traditional double wipers on other cars cleaned only 70–75% of the glass. Daimler-Benz conducted an enormous number of safety checks and crash tests during the development of the 124. As a result, this car was one of the safest cars of its time, not only for a driver and passengers, but for pedestrians as well. It had smartly engineered zones of program deformation, softer body lines decreasing the damage to pedestrians, ABS, traction control, and later airbags for a driver and optionally for a front passenger, and emergency seatbelt tensioners. The left and right side mirrors had different sizes for better visibility of blind spots and easier maneuvering on tight European streets and parking garages. The headrests of the rear row of seats could be folded by the driver by pressing a button on the center console for additional visibility and safety during backing up. The windshield washing liquid tank was heated, as well as the whole spraying system, which added a lot of safety in winter conditions in Northern Europe. In addition, the 124 had the same small but smart details that we could already see on the 190. Ripped rear lights for protection from dirt and dust, a large steering wheel alone control even in case of power steering failure, and multi-lever rear suspension helping driver to control the car in turns in all road conditions. The 124 had two facelifts during the time of its production. In 1989, the narrow black moldings on the sides of the car were replaced by white large plastic panels, known as the Saka planks, which we later could see on the W140. Also, the mirrors now were painted in the body color, and many other small details appeared like new door handles and wheels. The second facelift in 1993 brought different shape of the front grille and headlights, also in the style of the S-Class. The rear bumpers were extended to the rear wheels, and metal polished planks appeared on the fenders above the wheels. The wagon version of the 124 appeared at the end of 1985. It was the time when wagons were perceived more as utility car in Europe. So the Mercedes-Benz had to explain in its booklets and marketing materials that this was a car for all families and not only for builders and gardeners. Well, this was long before the time when SUVs became a family standard. It's interesting that wagons had different rear suspension than sedans. When sedans had a very complicated but reliable multi-lever suspension, wagons had even more complicated self-leveling pneumatic suspension in the style of Citroën. This suspension was at some point also an option for sedans and coupes, but as far as I know, it wasn't a popular one there. Also, wagons had an electric closing mechanism for the trunk door. You had just to softly close the trunk and the servo drive would canalize the closing process. The idea was to avoid loud noises if you close your trunk in your neighborhood late at night or early at the morning. The same closing service were later used for all doors on the W140. In 1987, a coupe version appeared. It was actually a very deeply re-engineered version of the 124, not just the same car with two doors instead of four. The roof became lower. The trunk lights were lowered as well for the better aerodynamics and look. The doors didn't have window frames, and the rear side windows had a very complicated opening mechanism. So you could lower all windows almost completely, and you had uninterrupted openings on the sides of the car for better look, design, and feeling of freedom and perfection. And if you wanted even more open air in your 124, you could have it starting from March of 1992, when a convertible version appeared. It was built on the basis of the coupe with the same design approach. By the way, coupes and convertibles were only 3 inches shorter than sedans, so even in two-door versions you had the same level of comfort both for front and rear passengers. In total, over 50 different versions of the 124 existed with different body styles and engines, plus an extensive list of options and trim levels. In addition, Daimler-Benz changed the branding of its models in 1993, with letters designating the class of the car, which added additional complications in the list of the versions. So the 124 became the first in the line of Mercedes-Benz E-Class cars. The list of engines was also very extensive. 30 factory options were available during the production period, including 18 gasoline and 12 diesel engines. And above this, there were several very interesting engines from AMG and other aftermarket upgraders. The list of options included 4-cylinder and 6-cylinder straight gasoline engines and a couple of V8 versions. First with 2 valves per cylinder, and starting from 1993, 4 valves per cylinder. The diesel line included engines with 4, 5 or 6 cylinders that were also updated around 1993. The 4-cylinder gasoline engines were available with displacement from 2 to 2.3 liters, producing from 104 to 148 horsepower. The standard 6-cylinder gasoline engines produced from 158 to 217 horses with a displacement from 2.6 to 3.2 liters. The V8 engines were available with 5-liter and later 4.2 versions producing from 275 to 322 horny ponies. The diesel engines included 4-cylinder 2-liter ones with around 70 horses, 2.5-liter 5-cylinder versions producing from 89 to 124 horsepower, and a line of 3-liter 6-cylinder engines with a power from 108 to 145 horses. The slowest 124 was a 2-liter diesel model with a top speed of 160 km or 99 miles per hour and 0 to 60 in long 18.5 seconds. Among gasoline engines, the slowest one was 2-liter carbureted engine on early cars, producing a top speed of 187 km or 116 miles per hour with 0 to 60 in 12.6 seconds. The fastest car among factory-produced models was the V8 500e produced together with Porsche. The top speed of this car was limited at 250 km or 155 miles per hour with 0 to 60 in 5.9 seconds. Among the cars produced purely by Daimler-Benz, the fastest one was E420, with the same V8 engine reduced from 5 to 4.2 liters. It had the same limited top speed of 155 miles per hour, but 0 to 60 it made only in 6.8 seconds. Still impressive. AMG produced several performance versions of the 124 with 3.6 6-cylinder engines and with V8s of 4.2 and 6 liters. The 6-liter version was the fastest 124 that was relatively widely produced. It had 376 crazy horses, a top speed limited at 250 km or 155 miles per hour, and 0 to 60 in 5.3 seconds. Plus, the suspension of the car was rebuilt that made it a way sportier. There were several even more powerful builds from various tuning studios, but those cars were more like one-off runs and were not available widely for public. And actually there were a lot of aftermarket updates available for the owners of the 124s, both for visual improvements and for the performance. Brabus, AMG, Koenig Specials, Lorenzer, Karat du Chalet, Oettinger, Rentech, all those great names could propose a lot of features for a dedicated and wealthy enough owner of this Mercedes car. Plus a lot of smaller studios from everywhere in the world. There were several special versions of the 124 that deserve to be mentioned specifically. First, the 124 500e. This car was produced from 1990 to 1994 in cooperation between Daimler-Benz and Porsche. The idea was to use a 5-liter V8 engine from the SL class Roadster to make a performance version of the 124. The Daimler's engineering department was busy developing the new S-Class W140, so they commissioned Porsche engineers to develop the car. They did their job, but they had to install wider front fenders to accommodate the bigger engine under the hood. And apparently with this wide body the car didn't fit the Mercedes production line. So the building process was very interesting and a little ridiculous. The Daimler-Benz supplied Porsche with parts, and Porsche assembled the body in Zuffenhausen. Then the body was shipped to Daimler's plant in Sindelfingen for painting. After that it went back to Porsche for assembling. And then again to Sindelfingen for final touches and quality inspections. No wonder that only 10,000 cars were produced in 4 years, and they are some kind of desirable rarity now, particularly in the United States, because only 1,500 of them were imported here. Another notable version is AMG Hammer, produced obviously by AMG on the basis of the 124 in the end of the 80s. AMG deeply rebuilt the whole car, improving the suspension, steering and the interior. But the most interesting improvement was of course under the hood. And there you could find a V8 engine from the large W126 Mercedes-Benz. Originally this engine had a 5.6-liter displacement, but AMG increased it up to 6 liters, which resulted in the power output of 355 horsepower, a claimed top speed of 305 km or 190 miles per hour, and 0 to 60 in 5 seconds. It is believed that only 30 Hammer sedans were made worldwide, including 13 for the United States, plus 5 coupes and only 1 wagon. AMG later made more popular and relatively affordable versions of the 124, E36 with a 3.6-liter engine and the E60 with a 6-liter V8, which I already talked about before. At the end of the production of the 124 in 1995, Daimler-Benz made a special farewell version of this car under the name Masterpiece. Technically, those cars were not different from other standard cars, but they had a rich interior trim and equipment and several unique features: a gear lever knob engraved with the word Masterpiece, stainless door seals engraved with Mercedes-Benz, and different wheels. The 124 was available with several transmissions. The cheaper versions were supplied with 4-speed manual transmissions. Wikipedia says that some cars with 4 gears had a gear lever mounted on the steering column, but I never met this option. All manual cars that I've seen had a floor-mounted gear lever. If you've seen a column-mounted one, tell me, it's interesting. More powerful and expensive engines were coupled with a 5-speed manual transmission. Also, a 4-speed automatic transmission was available as an option. Later, it was replaced with a 5-speed automatic transmission. Most cars sold in the United States were automatic. In 1986, an all-wheel drive system Firmatic became available for the 124. So the 124 became the first Mercedes sedan with an optional all-wheel drive system. This was, of course, a competitive answer to the Quattro system of Audi 100, which I have another video about. But unlike Quattro, the Firmatic was a very complicated system. It combined information from the 3-channel ABS system and the steering wheel angle sensor to decide when to use electronics and hydraulics to engage and disengage the front drive and when to lock and unlock central and rear differentials. The car had a rear-wheel drive in most cases, but when necessary, the Firmatic could automatically transfer 35 and then 50% of torque to the front wheels. This was a very interesting system, but it was far from ideal in its work, and it wasn't very reliable at the beginning. Above this, it was expensive, adding almost 30% to the price of the car. So, not many buyers choose to add it to the list of options on their cars, and the 124s with this system are rare animals. Inside, the car was very comfortable and very convenient. The ergonomics was perfect. All switches, controls and gauges, everything was on its place, exactly where you expected to find it. The details were very well thought of. For example, there was a third small sun visor above the salon mirror to protect you from the sunlight when 2 usual sun visors were not enough. The soundproofing was very effective. You could hear the tires sometimes, but there was no sound of wind and the engine sound became hearable only at high revs. The seats were very comfortable, particularly in the later years, when Mercedes began using formed foam rear seats instead of spring-based seats. It was very pleasant to be in that car both as a driver and a passenger. It was one of the most comfortable cars of its time. In fact, the 124 is maybe more comfortable than many today's cars. But what about the driving experience? Well, this topic is a little more controversial. Don't get me wrong, the car was almost perfect on the road and it was very pleasant to drive. It was very stable, predictable, and safe in virtually all situations and road conditions. It looked solid, it felt solid, and it was solid. But it wasn't a fun to drive car. Despite its relatively lightweight and great aerodynamics, the 124 wasn't a fast or energetic car in the most of its versions. Most of the diesel versions made 0 to 60 in above 13 seconds. The gasoline cars were faster, but not too exciting, around 9 seconds for most of 6-cylinder versions and way over 10 for the 4-cylinder cars. Even powerful V8 models never could be considered as sports cars in their factory versions. I've never driven the 500e, but Doug DeMira owned one, and he was slightly disappointed with its driving characteristic by his own words. At the same time, he really liked the handling and dynamics of the AMG E60 version. But the 124 was never about performance. It was about convenience, practicality, reliability, and comfort. And in those areas, none of its contemporary competitors could really beat it. Car journalists of the 80s and beginning of the 90s did many competitive tests of the 124, comparing it to Audi 100, BMW of the 5 and 7 series, Saab 9000, Renault 25, Jaguar XJ, and Ford Scorpio. In majority of those tests, the Mercedes-Benz was a champion with the Audi 100 usually at the second place. The 124 could be more expensive than competitors, but it kept its resale value better, and buyers got more car for their money than with other options. In addition, the Mercedes proposed a huge variety of versions, trims and engines, so you could order a car virtually for any budget. No wonder that this car became the best-selling premium German midsize sedan of its time and ever before. Despite the lack of the dynamics in more affordable versions, the car with more expensive 6-cylinder engines were fast enough to never make their owners ashamed on German autobahns. They could go fast, and they were safe and solid even at really high speeds. and they had very good maneuverability in turns thanks to their complicated rear suspension that helped with steering. You probably wouldn't get too excited of driving along a curvy road, but you could be sure that you are safe and comfortable during your ride. And it was a very reliable car, legendary reliable, virtually immortal. The diesel engines maybe were slower, but they proved their capability to live for 1,000,000 miles without serious rebuilding. The gasoline engines also deserved a perfect reputation. You can see many cars with 300 miles and more on the odometer still on the road. In fact, I suppose that a large part of those 2.5 million ever made, maybe even a quarter of them, are still in use. You can still easily see them around in the United States and Europe, and there are plenty of them still alive in Africa, Asia and Middle East, where they came after serving first decades of their career in Europe and America. They may be not in the best shape now, but they still live, drive and help their owners in many situations. The 124 was an ideal car for European taxi drivers. It was relatively inexpensive and economic, it was spacious and comfortable, and it was reliable and practically immortal. And if you think of the European taxi of the 80s and 90s, you think either of the 124 or the 190. First in the Western Europe, and then those cars continued their career in the Central and Southern Europe, and maybe still work hard in Africa and Asia. The Mercedes-Benz 124 was a unique car in the car history. It was a great car, one of the best cars ever made. It wasn't a car with a particularly bright history, but it played a huge role in all European auto market of the 80s and 90s. An over-engineered car combining practicality with comfort, design with power, affordability with impossible reliability. The car representing the whole different world, an absolutely different approach to the car making. The car which can be equated only with cars of the same era and the same manufacturer, the 190 and the W140. The car like never before and never after. The car that is unfortunately impossible today. A true masterpiece. Many of the 124s were sold in the United States during their production, and there are still a lot of them around, both on the road and on sale. So, if you want one, you probably can find one within 100 miles from your home. But if you are looking for a car with manual transmission, or for some rare version of the 124 like the AMG E60 or the 500e, you can also take a look at the European market. All those cars are older than 25 years, so you can legally import them to the United States. But keep in mind that most of those cars were heavily used by their owners, and many have a plenty of miles on the odometer. That's not particularly bad considering the reliability of the 124, but if you look for a fresh car with low miles, finding it may be a challenge. And it could be more expensive than you expect. Despite the solid reputation of those cars, they do have a couple of problematic zones that you might want to check before buying. The biggest problem is rust. Daimler-Benz used a good quality strong steel for its cars in the 80s, but still it wasn't galvanized, so it may get rusty, and it does. I recommend looking for a car from a warm climate and checking the undercarriage in any case. Another area requiring attention is the electrics, wiring and sensors. Well, it is a common problematic spot for all Mercedes cars, new and old. Luckily, the replacement parts are usually easily available and don't cost an arm and a leg. I also would steer away from the cars with a Firmatic all-wheel drive system, especially the early ones from the 80s. And if you are buying a car with a 6-cylinder engine, a great choice by the way, make sure that there are no oil leaks anywhere on the engine, and the oil in the engine is clear and not contaminated with coolant. Those engines have a very long engine head, so if the engine was ever overheated, the head can lose its shape, causing oil and coolant leaks and cross-contamination that will lead to the expensive repair or replacement of the engine head. Well, most of those issues are common for any 30 years old cars. But when other cars with those symptoms are dying, the 124 just require a little of love and care. In the United States, you can buy the 124 in very good condition now for $6,000 to $15,000 for a sedan or a wagon. But you can find a project car literally for $1,000 or $1,500 near you, and maybe even drive it home. The coupes and convertibles are from $10,000 to $30,000 depending on the mileage, condition and greed of the seller. In Europe, a regular sedan or a wagon in very good condition will be from 4 to 20,000 euros. But again, there are cheaper options in project condition. The asking price for coupes and convertibles is from 8 to 25,000 euros. The V8 versions, 500e and 420, listed in the range from 25 to 50,000 euros. But there is always a space for negotiations. The top AMG versions of the 124 are significantly more expensive and usually sold at auctions. The AMG E60 will probably go above $150,000, and the AMG Hammer will probably be around $500,000–700,000 and maybe even aim to $1 million. But this is a different, very special story when the uniqueness of the car fully justifies its price. Well, thank you very much for watching. If you owned one of the 124s, please tell me about your experience. How comfortable and how reliable this car was in real life. What did you like about it and what didn't? It's always so great to read your stories, guys. Thank you so much for your comments. And if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. New interesting stories are coming soon. Danke schön, mein Freunde, and see you next time.